This is Erfurt and this is Lipsk. They're part of the Leibniz Binary Subsystem, which is a set of Eurorack modules from Xaoc Devices that work with 8-bit digital signals. They connect to each other around the back via their own special bus, and they work with standard Eurorack connections on the front. Now, the Leibniz Binary Subsystem isn't necessarily the easiest concept to get your head around, and I have to admit I found it a bit intimidating when I first started looking into it. The conventional starting point is the Drezno module, which lets you convert analog signals to digital, perform various operations on the digital bits, and then convert them back to analog, which opens up all manner of unique distortion, wave shaping, and bit crushing effects. But in this video, I'm not going to go down that route. Instead, I'm going to show you an alternative way into this intriguing digital universe, this pairing of Erfurt and Lipsk, which Xaoc Devices have very kindly sent over for me to check out. I'll show you how these two modules, which are basically a kind of counter and some switches, offer a different, much simpler way to bring an 8-bit binary dimension to your modular setup. More importantly, I'm going to show you how you can use them to make music, rhythms, melodies, and useful modulation, not just weird and crazy noises. So here's a little taste of what's coming up. So first up, I should say that I'm not going to go into all that much detail about the Leibniz Binary Subsystem itself in this video. Erfurt and Lipsk can certainly do a lot of interesting things when they're connected to the other modules in the range, like Drezno and Jena, and I am planning to cover some of that stuff in future videos. But they can also do a lot as a standalone pair, and that's what I really want to focus on here. I'm going to be using Moskwa and Odessa in this video at various points too, and they also have Leibniz functionality, but I won't be using that here. All you really need to know for now is that I've connected the Leibniz output of Lipsk to the Leibniz input of Erfurt via the 10-pin connectors on the back. So what actually is Erfurt? Well, in classic Xaoc Devices style, the front panel calls it a binary phase accumulator, but in simple terms it's a counter which keeps track of a number. It starts at 0, and every time it gets a clock at the clock increase input, or you press this up button, it adds 1 to the number. When it gets a clock at the clock decrease input, or you press the down button, it subtracts 1. The current number is represented in binary using 8 bits, and each bit has a corresponding LED and gate output. When each bit is on, or 1, the corresponding output produces a 5-volt gate. Now, there is just one bit of theory I want to cover here, which I think is pretty key to understanding what's going on with these modules, and that's how binary numbers work. If you're already familiar with this stuff, then do feel free to skip ahead to the patches, but if you need it, here's a quick refresher. So the standard number system for humans is called decimal, or base 10, and we probably ended up using it because we have 10 fingers. We count up in units from 0 to 9, and then we start a new column to record the tens. Once we count up to 9 tens and 9 ones, 99, we start a new column to keep track of the hundreds. When we reach 999, we start a new column to keep track of the thousands, and so on. The columns represent powers of 10. 10 to the power of 0 is 1, 10 to the power of 1 is 10, 10 to the power of 2 is 100, and so on. Binary, or base 2, works on the same principle, but instead of having 10 different digits, 0 to 9, it uses just 2, 0 and 1. This means that when we've counted 0 and 1, we need to start a new column to keep track of the 2s. Once we've counted up to 3, which is 1, 1 in binary, 1, 2 and 1, 1, we need to start a new column to keep track of the 4s. And we keep adding columns in the same way according to powers of 2 rather than 10, which means they double each time. So each binary digit, which can be on or off, 1 or 0, is known as a bit, short for binary digit, and an 8-bit binary number has 8 of these columns representing 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64 and 128. And this means an 8-bit number can have 256 possible values, ranging from 8 zeros to 8 ones and all the possible permutations in between. What Erfurt gives you is a set of 8 gate outputs that are either on or off, depending on whether the corresponding bit has a value of 0 or 1 in the binary number that it's keeping track of. That binary number increases or decreases when you feed clocks into Erfurt, and when the counter reaches 255, when all 8 bits are on, the next positive clock will reset it and it'll start again from 0. You can also reset the counter via a trigger at the reset input or by pressing both these buttons together. Now, Erfurt uses a vertical layout to represent the number in order to fit up and down the panel, with the rightmost or least significant bit at the bottom. So just think of it as the number rotated 90 degrees clockwise. There's one other thing on the front panel that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the internal high-frequency Leibniz clock. That runs at 2 megahertz. You can switch it on and off here, and you can use this switch to pick between 3 different divisions, 1 to 256, 1 to 1, or 1 to 64,000. That's the only one you can really see happening. The others are so fast. Now, this is really only something you'd use as part of a more complex Leibniz setup with other modules, and it's overridden when you're clocking it externally, so it's not something that's really going to feature in any of the patches I'm looking at today. But it can be quite a handy way to see the standard bit pattern as it counts up. Okay, so at this point you might be wondering what you'd actually use a counter for in a modular music system. Well, if I start a slow regular count upwards by feeding a clock to the clock increase input, you'll notice some patterns in the way these bits change. The bottom, or least significant bit, alternates between a 1 and 0 with every clock received. So for every 2 clocks we get 1 gate out. The next bit up stays on for 2 clocks and then goes off for 2. So this bit output we get 1 longer gate starting every 4 clocks. The next bit up is on for 4, then off for 4, so we get 1 even longer gate which starts every 8 clocks, and so on. This means Erfurt is basically acting as a straightforward clock divider which divides the input clock by 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128 and 256. And so you can use Erfurt to do all the stuff you might do with any other clock divider that offers these divisions. It works at audio rates too. There's a frequency divider, so if you feed an oscillator into it, you'll get unipolar square waves out, which halve in frequency at each bit output. It's basically a square wave sub-oscillator with outputs that span 8 octaves, if you use it like that. But where things get really interesting is when you bring Lipsk into play. By connecting Lipsk to Erfurt via the Leibniz bus on the rear, you can use the 8 buttons to define another binary number that controls the count increment. With just the bottom button on, Erfurt will count up or down in 1s, one at a time. With just the second button on, it will count in 2s. With both those on, each clock will increase or decrease the count by 3, and so on. Whenever the count passes 255, the remainder is wrapped around as it starts counting up again, and this quickly produces much more complex gate patterns. You can control this even further by feeding other gates into the inputs on Lipsk to turn these switches on or off. You can even patch from Erfurt back into Lipsk so that when a particular bit turns on in the counter, it will change the rate of the count. You can probably see that with just a bit of patching, things can get very complex very quickly. Finally, just before we get into the patches, a quick note on the difference between the clock increase and clock decrease inputs. When you're using Erfurt to program rhythms, you'll probably want to use the clock decrease input. That's because for rhythm programming, counting backwards produces what's known as musical clock division, where you start from the point where all the gates are high, and the various rhythmic subdivisions are all lined up. Here's a diagram from the manual which shows the difference. If you start the count from 0 and work up, you get what's known as mathematical division, which means that each time a new bit enters the pattern, the previous bits will all be 0. Now this is fine for some things, but for drum programming, the reverse clock gives you rhythms which are lined up, in sync, and much more musically useful. Okay, that's enough theory. Let's start to patch up some sound so you can hear what I've been talking about. Let's start with a rhythm generator kind of patch. I've got Pamela's new workout here set up with a 16th note clock going into the clock decrease input on Erfurt. I've got a reset signal trigger going in every 2 bars, which will kind of help keep that pattern under control once we start getting a bit more experimental. I've got a ×1, just a 4/4 kick drum trigger output from the first output of Pamela's new workout, which will act as a kind of metronome and anchor this patch. And if I just start Pamela's new workout, there's the kick drum. And if we start patching in some other drum sounds, these are just various 808 and 909 modules from my other rack off screen. As we put these lower 4 bits in, we get these very regular rhythms which are coming just at divisions of that 16th note clock. Very straightforward. And now with Lipsk connected, if I switch the increment from 1 to, say, 3 by adding the next bit up, we immediately get a more interesting pattern. And just by playing around with these bits in Lipsk and changing the sort of distance of the count each time, we get a great range of rhythms like this. From the slightly more regular to a lot more syncopated. And let's just patch another couple of sounds into these other bits. I've got a couple of other percussion kind of elements. This is the new Systems Instruments harmonic shift oscillator. Just going through the Optimix, I've got 2 channels of that, pan slightly left and right. And I'm just sweeping with an LFO from Aux the harmonic stride. So we get this kind of nice atonal, west coasty kind of, almost like a buchla bongo sort of sound. Sounds a bit like a phaser as well. And now if we bring up some of these even higher increments, we get these nice complex patterns. we can start having a bit of fun as well. If you take one of the other bit outputs from Erfurt, one of these very high ones, let's take this second highest, patch that into one of the Lipsk inputs. Let's try number 1. That means whenever this bit goes high in Erfurt, it's going to activate that bit in Lipsk, which is going to change the clock increment, which gives us even more kind of rhythmic variety. And because we're resetting this every 2 bars, it never gets too out of control. If you take the reset out, we can let these patterns play on a bit longer. So you can get these nice complex drum patterns very easily. Let's put the reset back in. And you'll see that you get kind of, the more of these lower bits are on, you get a bit more activity in the sounds at the bottom end. And with these higher bits active in Lipsk, you get this bit more going on with these new percussion sounds at the top. So I find this is a really great source of interesting drum patterns just from patching up these 4 drum sounds and a couple of extra percussion bits. With that kick drum anchoring the whole thing. It's a really cool way to get some rhythm ideas. Okay, in this patch I'm going to use Erfurt to provide some kind of rhythmic modulation sources for various things in this patch. I've got it set up similarly to the drum patch. I've got a 16th note going into the clock. This time I'm going to the clock increase rather than decrease. Got the same reset patch, so it'll reset every 2 bars. And I'm also running the same clock and reset into the Moskwa, which is playing a sequence on Sophia from Xaoc Devices over here. That's running through the Expert Sleeper's Persephone, and the envelope that's opening that VCA is the New Systems Instruments Inertia, which is just a nice, simple, snappy envelope. So it's a really simple sequence. So let's start by taking a couple of these bit outputs and doing something with the sequence. I'm just going to take bit 2 for the sake of argument. Let's go into random. So now whenever this bit goes high, it will basically boost that randomize to maximum, and you'll get these little random changes to the sequence. And if I let's take bit 6, and I'm going to attenuate this slightly through quadrat. Let's go into the transpose input. So now whenever it gets up to bit 6, transpose the sequence so we get a bit more interest. I've just upped the Lipsk interval there so it hits that bit a bit more often. And now let's get some modulation going into Sophia as well. Let's just take bit 1. Let's go into the ratio. Let's take bit 3 into the damp. And let's take another one into the warp. I'm not even going to attenuate this, I'm just going to go straight in. We've instantly got this much more interesting sequence where there's some notes are getting modulation hit into Sophia. And again, by doing what we were doing last time with Lipsk, we can change the pattern of that modulation. It's not changing the sequence, but it's changing the way the modulation is interacting with it. So the transpose will be slightly different, the randomizing will be different. And as before, we could go wild and self-patch. But you can see just by, again, feeding this with a steady clock, playing around with these increments, a bit of self-patching, you get these really interesting modulation patterns, which can not only liven up the sequence notes, but can also liven up the timbre of that sound quite extensively. Again, Sophia's not going through a filter, this is just all the internal patching in Sophia. If you like the sound of that, check out my previous video on Sophia. Okay, for this patch I'm going to explore using Erfurt as a melodic sequencer by taking 4 of its bit outputs, mixing and attenuating them, or attenuating and mixing them rather, and then using that as a volt per octave sequence to power a voice. In this case it's going to be a Dessa. So I've got these 4-bit outputs, each going into the Quadrat IntelliGel kind of mixer attenuator here, and I've got the summed output of that going into the volt per octave. I'm actually going into the Hell expander, which will quantize it, which will make the tuning a little bit easier. Let's just fire off some 16th notes to open the VCA that the Odessa's feeding through. Got a little bit of modulation set up on Odessa. I've got a slow LFO onto warp, and I've got some sample and hold into density, just to kind of vary the tone a bit. So this is our kind of root note. And I haven't got any clock going into Erfurt, so I can manually select, I can manually count up. So let's just select bit 1, which is the first of the outputs here that I've got going into Quadrat. And now if I tune, let's tune that up a 5th. And then if I activate bit 2, let's tune that up a minor 3rd. Now if I go back down again, so when bit 1 is active on its own, we're getting a 5th. When this bit 2 is active, we're getting a minor 3rd, and when they're both active, they're adding together, they're being summed, so we're getting a minor 7th. So let's go up to the next bit. Let's try a 4th for this one. And again, as I step up, get these nice kind of additions which all work musically. And for the 4th one, let's try an octave. It should be fairly safe. Let's just go through these again. So you can hear all those combinations of bits are producing kind of intervals which work well with each other. So it's a 5th, a minor 3rd, a 4th, and an octave I've gone for. Obviously you can try any combination that works. Now for the clock for Erfurt for this one, let's try something slightly different as well. I'm going to route the clock through the transient module's U1P. This is basically half a mutable instrument's branches, which will allow us to use probability to split the clock between 2 outputs. And I'm going to go into the increment and decrement, or the increase and decrease. At the moment this is going, every clock is going through that output, which means it's stepping up in sequence like this. Already it's quite a nice melodic sequence. If I switch, if I dial across to output B, now all the clocks are going to the decrease and it's kind of playing the sequence backwards. In the middle, it's randomly picking one, so it's kind of jumping forwards and backwards, it's moving through it in a kind of random way, which can be quite nice. Let's just go back to the increment only. And let's go for a slightly more interesting rhythm pattern for the sequence. Let's take this is just a Euclidean trigger pattern from one of the other outputs of PAMs. You notice I haven't used the reset on Erfurt for this one. I think it's, at the moment, I'm just looping one step at a time with Lipsk set to the first bit only. I'm going to put the reset in because it's going to get a bit more complicated. And now if we do what we've been doing before and adjust this increment with Lipsk, we now get these really nice sequences. Now remember, all the pitches are being determined by these bit outputs and however much we attenuate them, so we could play with those attenuators to change the tuning. I'm going to leave them as they are because I've got them kind of working quite nicely. I'm going to try a little bit of feedback patching again. Let's try bit 7 from Erfurt into bit 1 of Lipsk. Just going to open that envelope slightly. Let's play with Odessa. Let's play with Lipsk a bit more. Lovely melodies emerging. And of course we could play with feeding gate patterns from Pamela's new workout into Lipsk to make this a bit more ordered. And let's just try messing with that clock running order as well. So we're going alternating randomly now between increasing and decreasing the clock into Erfurt. chaotic in the center. Now let's just run it backwards. Just an instant ideas machine, kind of like a Turing machine with a slightly different, more controllable kind of vibe. Okay, so I'm going to take the melodic sequencing idea from the previous patch a step further and use Odessa with its Hell expander to do some kind of polyphonic sequencing. And rather than using 4-bit outputs, attenuating them and mixing them to produce a single or productive sequence, what I'm going to do is attenuate them individually and then feed them into the Hell expander for Odessa, which lets you play up to 5 voices paraphonically. Now I'm going to use 4-bit outputs and I'm going to use Quadrat to mix them, and although I've got 5 inputs here, I'm just going to double up the last one. I'm going to make a copy of the 4th one, run it through the Xaoc Tessitura tailor, which is an octave switcher, and just get a copy of that 4th one an octave up. So we'll get 5 voices, one of which will just be the same in 2 octaves. So I've got Odessa set up droning basically at the moment, and I've got a simple clock going into the clock increment and a reset every 4 bars. I've got a slightly slower clock, I'm running at 8th notes on this one, so times 2. And if I just step up through the sequence so that we're getting some activity happening with these bits, and then I could just start to tune in the individual voices using the attenuators on Quadrat like this. There's an octave. Minor 7th there. Let's go for a 3rd and then go for a 5th there. Now, because the Hell expander quantizes the inputs, it makes it quite easy to dial in nice intervals. Got a bit of modulation going into Odessa, just to the density and warp. And I've got a couple of other bit outputs I can take, which I'm running through another attenuator just to modify the harmonic factor and the tilt. Now at the pace of the sequence, it's not really going to activate these bits yet. But when I do speed up the interval, start to activate these bits, which are going to hit. The tilt and speed up a bit more so that it activates this. So we've got quite a nice complex kind of like a broken chord basically. I've tuned in the values I want with this attenuator. Let's get this a little more interesting. I've got another output from Pamela's new workout on a divide by 16, which I'm going to put into the pitch input, and I've attenuated this right down and quantized it so it's going to transpose up a 5th. So we get 2 bars basically at the root pitch, 2 bars at another interval. And let's take Lipsk down to just counting up in singles. And I've got this other output from Pamela's new workout, which is just a gate, which I've got on divide 32. Hit that into bit 3. So this will give us a pattern where we get 2 bars at the root pitch, 2 bars at the transposed up, then 2 bars at a different rate of Erfurt change, and then transposed. Now we get the faster version. Lipsk as we always have been by manually adding some extra bits to that number. It's a way of getting these really nice complex broken chords with a bit of rhythmic variety. Again, all I'm feeding in here is a steady 8th note clock, some slow divisions to these. I've tuned in some intervals for the voices manually here. Of course I can play around with these while we're doing all this. Get some nice tone clusters play with the octave switch for that top voice. Okay, for this last patch I'm going to look at using Erfurt audio rates as a frequency divider. I'm going to feed in an oscillator to the clock increase input. In this case it's the New Systems Instruments harmonic shift oscillator. This is the pitch I'm feeding it, so quite a high sine wave. And then these bit outputs are going to produce square waves at octave subdivisions of that master frequency. So here's the first bit output. I'm just going to run it through blinds. You can see on the scope it's producing this square wave, which is an octave below this sine. As I skip through these bits, you hear it goes down the octaves. Now Lipsk doesn't have all that much effect in this kind of patch. On these bits 1 and 2, then toggling bits 1 and 2 here, produce these nice kind of overtones. Changing the shape slightly, counting up in 3s rather than 1s. But that won't have any effect at these less significant bits. But I will use a little bit of automation on this bit on Lipsk in a little while when I build this patch up a bit. What I'm going to do is take 4 of these sub-octaves and I'm going to alternately invert them in blinds so that we get this bipolar wave, because remember they're all unipolar, 0 to 5 volts. And by alternately inverting them I get this nice interesting stepped wave shape. And if you've been watching my channel for a while, you might have seen a video I did a while ago where I used a Doepfer A162 clock divider to do a very similar patch to this, taking 4 of these subdivided frequency outputs, using blinds to attenuate and invert them. And I'm just shamelessly going to recreate that patch here because it's quite an interesting one. I'm going to take 4 LFOs from Oct. It doesn't really matter what rates, they're all slightly different. And go into these CV inputs on blinds. So I can just let these subdivisions kind of rise and fall, giving us this constantly evolving kind of wave shape. I'm running the output of blinds, the mix of these 4, through New Systems Instruments inertia as a filter, so I can start to roll off some of that high end, add a bit of resonance. Add some effects, and let's got a little 4-step sequence set up from Joe Analog step 8 into the volt per octave, just to give us a bit of melodic movement very slowly. I'm going to take this other output from Pamela's new workout into that bit 1 input of Lipsk, just to give us a little bit more rhythmic tone variety there. And that's kind of it, just using these 4 sub-octaves, mixing them with blinds, doing a little bit of inversion and level control with these LFOs. It gives us this nice shifting, complex wave. Basically turning this very plain sine wave output into this very complex, multiple pulse kind of tone. So that's kind of it for the video. I hope this has given you a little flavour of what Erfurt is capable of when used outside of the rest of the Leibniz Binary Subsystem. The 2 of these modules have all sorts of other uses if you're using them with Drezno and Jena, but as a way in, as a sort of first starting point, I think you can do a great deal of stuff with these that you can't do with a conventional clock divider. Really useful for rhythmic modulation, kind of melodic sequencing, pseudo-random kind of pattern generation. And yeah, a good gateway drug into the wider universe of Leibniz. So if you've enjoyed this, please do like and subscribe, leave a comment, let me know if you've got any questions. I'll be back soon with more, and I'm hoping to dive a bit more into the rest of the Leibniz Binary Subsystem later this year. So let me know if there's anything you'd like to know, and I'll see you next time.